Good morning, everyone. Datuk Samanan, Director of Sabah Forestry, welcome to join us. M.R. Chandran, Advisor to RSPO, Mr. Yankee Swiss, President of RSPO, dear participants. After 2 days of very intensive and broad discussions on the development of the sustainable palm oil sector, I am now going to, for 15 minutes, narrow the discussion down a little bit and focus on an aspect of the sector which is relevant for the EU in accordance with our legislation, and that is biofuels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief EU context and then focus on the EU Renewable Energy Directive, its sustainability criteria, voluntary certification schemes and their role, latest developments, and some of the implications of the directive for palm oil. I will also say a few words about the new labeling, food labeling rules in the EU, which will have an implication on vegetable oils labeling for food products. So just to give you an idea of the context in which the EU is operating, the latest EU-wide polls on climate change show that more than 2 Europeans in 3 see climate change as a very serious problem. Almost 80% consider that taking action to combat climate change can boost the economy and jobs. So this goes to show that this is not only an EU, a member state government-driven process, but it is foremost a prerogative by the European Parliament, by the European public. The EU is on a sure path towards low-carbon economy and is taking measures to that aim. So a milestone in this process of transition is the 2008 Climate and Energy Package, which sets legally binding targets for the EU by 2020. That is a reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases by 20%, 20% reduction of energy consumption, and achieving 20% of renewables in the overall energy mix. We have followed that up last year by setting up a growth strategy for the EU for sustainable and inclusive growth. And we are also already now looking beyond those 2020 objectives and to see how we fulfill our other goal, which is reducing domestic emissions by 80 to 95% by 2020. So the Commission has earlier this year published a roadmap on moving to a low-carbon economy by 2020. We're also trying to mainstream this into our other policies. So just an example, the Common Agricultural Policy is also undertaking a revision at the moment. But what I would like to focus on more today is a piece of legislation relevant for our discussion, and that's the EU Renewable Energy Directive, or the EU RED. It is part of the EU Climate and Energy Package, focusing specifically on the 20% target for renewables in the overall energy mix. Member states have mandatory targets to varying degrees, amounting to 20% on the EU level. But there is a specific 10% target for renewable energy in transport in all member states. As we all know, the directive comes with provisions for biofuel sustainability. The reason for that is because we have to make sure that biofuels contribute to the objectives of our overall policy. It makes no sense to solve a problem by creating another one elsewhere. So this is where the biofuel sustainability criteria come into the picture. There are 3 criteria mainly, 2 focusing on land use. So there can be no feedstock coming from land with high carbon stock or from land that has high biodiversity value. The 3rd criterion is the greenhouse gas emission saving, and the directive sets a benchmark of 35% for biofuels to be considered sustainable. There's a 4th one, as you can see, but that only applies to domestic EU production. So these criteria have to be met in order to receive incentives from individual member states and count towards the target, both the 10 and the 20%. But I have to reiterate that this does not stop trade in other biofuels, so the trade can still continue. They just won't be eligible for incentives. And so the question is how to prove compliance. Economic operators have to provide basically two types of information: the type of the raw material used, with possibly production process, you'll see later why that is important, and the land where it came from. And there has to be, the directive requires of economic operators to arrange for an adequate standard of independent auditing, and that can be done through voluntary schemes, among other options. In June last year, the Commission published further guidelines focusing on practical implementation of the criteria, voluntary schemes, and the future updating of the default values. The land-based criteria are fairly straightforward, but where things become a little bit complicated and sometimes controversial is the greenhouse gas emission saving figure. So there are various options of how one can comply with that, can calculate that figure. And one of them is the default values. These are the predetermined values in the Annex 5 of the directive, which are set at a conservative level. So this is done so that to avoid economic operators to claim values better than their actual values. The objective of the default values is to reduce administrative burden, but they are by no means mandatory. So an economic operator can also use actual values for this compliance. The default values are set for different typical types of biofuels, and you can see here an excerpt from Annex 5. On your left-hand side, you see the biofuel production pathways, and on your right-hand side, you see the default values for these particular pathways. When you look at the bottom two lines, you see that they both refer to palm oil biodiesel. The first one is when the process is not specified, and the default value is 19%. But you see that if methane capture is, and so 19% does not reach the threshold of the directive, but you see if you do methane capture at meals, the value is actually 56%, and makes that biodiesel sustainable under the directive. Voluntary certification schemes are one way of showing compliance with the sustainability criteria. And these voluntary certification schemes can apply for recognition at the EU level.